Snow began to fall quietly over Maplewood, a small town wrapped in the soft calm of December. The streets were nearly empty, lined with twinkling lights and frosted windows. Inside a corner bookstore called Collins & Co., Emma Collins sat by the window, a cup of warm tea beside her. Watching the snow gather on the sidewalk, the world outside felt peaceful, but inside, her heart carried a quiet loneliness she could never quite shake. She was in her late 30s, kind-eyed, thoughtful, and the sort of person who always remembered small details about others, but often forgot to care for herself. The bookstore had once been her father's dream, a place filled with rare novels and memories of long afternoons spent reading together. After he passed away, Emma took over, turning it into something special, or cozy little haven with old books, soft lamps, and the smell of coffee drifting through the air. It had charm, but it was also lonely. Most days customers came and went quickly, too busy for conversation. Emma smiled politely, said her thank yous, and returned to her quiet thoughts. That morning the clock struck 10, and she flipped the close sign to open. Outside, the snow kept falling in soft sheets, painting everything white. Emma sighed and picked up a stack of returned books, placing them back on the shelves. She wasn't expecting many customers. It was too cold, too quiet for anyone to wander in. But just as she turned toward the counter, the bell above the door chimed. A man stepped in, brushing snow from his coat. He looked like he'd been walking for a while, his hair slightly damp, his cheeks touched with cold. He wasn't young, but not old either, somewhere in his 40s, tall, with a calm presence that felt oddly comforting. His eyes were warm brown, and his smile appeared naturally, not forced or rehearsed. "Hi," he said, glancing around the shop. "It's warm in here." That's already a good sign. Emma smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Welcome in. Looking for anything special?" He hesitated, his eyes roaming over the books. "Something unexpected," he said slowly. "Something that feels like a gift, maybe. I don't really know what I want." Emma tilted her head, curious. "Are you looking for a story or a feeling?" He chuckled at her question, his voice soft. "Maybe both." "Do you sell that here?" She smiled back. "Depends on how you read." The air between them felt easy, natural. He introduced himself as Daniel Harper. He was new in town. He said moved here from Seattle a few weeks ago. He wanted to escape the noise of the city, start over somewhere quiet. Emma nodded. She understood that kind of escape. Maplewood was full of people like that, people trying to find peace in the silence. As they spoke, Emma guided him through the aisles, pointing out a few of her favorite title stories about second chances, lost dreams, and love that comes unexpectedly. Daniel listened carefully, sometimes smiling, sometimes pausing, as if the words meant more to him than he wanted to admit. There was something grounded about him, gentle but thoughtful, like someone who'd lived through storms and learned to stand quietly afterward. When he finally chose a book, he lingered by the counter instead of leaving right away. "This place feels different," he said, glancing around. "It's quiet but not empty. I don't know how to explain it." Emma gave a small, knowing smile. "Maybe it's because the books listen better than people do." He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that felt genuine. That might be true. As he reached for his wallet, Emma noticed his hand slightly rough, maybe from work or travel. His wedding ring finger was bare, but faintly marked as if it had once held one. She didn't ask, and he didn't explain. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, comfortable, as if both had already said too much without words. When Daniel left, the bell chimed again, and a swirl of cold air rushed in behind him. Emma stood by the counter for a moment, looking at the door long after it closed. She wasn't sure why his presence lingered in her mind, but it did. Maybe it was his voice, low and calm, or the way he seemed to notice small things. The old chair by the corner, the handwritten quote framed on the wall. Most people walked past those details. As the day went on, Emma tried to push him out of her thoughts. She had orders to arrange, shelves to dust, tea to brew. But every time she glanced toward the window, she half expected him to walk back in. It was strange. She'd met hundreds of customers over the years, but none had left her feeling this kind of warmth like something inside her had. Quietly stirred awake after a long sleep. When the clock neared closing time, the snow outside had grown heavier. The streets shimmered under streetlights, and the whole town looked like a Christmas postcard. Emma locked the door, turned off most of the lights, and sat for a moment behind the counter. The book Daniel had bought was still fresh in her memory, The Winter Garden, a story about love rediscovered in unexpected places. She wondered if he chose it by chance or if something about the story had called to him. It's the same way he seemed to have called to her heart without meaning to. She laughed quietly to herself. She was being silly. It was just a customer, just a stranger passing through town. Yet deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something about that moment, that meeting, had felt different. It wasn't dramatic or grand, but it was real. It was quiet, gentle, like the first snowfall after a long storm, as she put on her coat and stepped outside. The cold air brushed against her face, and for the first time in months, Emma felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. Not the loud kind that promises too much, but the soft kind that slips in when you least expect it. The snow fell heavier now, and the world felt quiet and new. Somewhere deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she didn't even know she'd been waiting for. Inside the bookstore, the light she had forgotten to turn off flickered softly against the shelves. One book lay slightly open on the table, a faint breeze turning its page. On the corner of the counter, Daniel's receipt still sat where he had signed it, with a neat, careful handwriting that Emma found herself tracing with her eyes before locking the door behind her that night. As she walked home under the falling snow, she smiled to herself, not knowing why. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, something gentle, something that felt like a gift she hadn't expected. And as the quiet town of Maplewood slept under its blanket of white, Emma's heart began to wake again, one soft beat at a time. The next few weeks in Maplewood passed quietly, but for Emma, they carried a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Every Thursday, without fail, Daniel returned to her bookstore. At first, he came just to buy books, but soon it became more than that. He'd stay longer, sometimes talking about the stories he'd read. Sitting in the little reading corner with a cup of coffee Emma offered him. There was no rush between them, no grand words, just calm, steady moments that began to fill the quiet spaces of both their lives. Daniel told her that he worked remotely as a writer for a small magazine. He said he had once been married, but the relationship had ended quietly, without anger, just to people who lost their way. He had left Seattle because the city felt too full of noise and memories. Emma listened, never pushing for more. She had her own silences, her own scars. In that small bookstore, they found something neither had been looking for: comfort. One Thursday evening, the weather turned rough. The wind howled outside, and snow piled up on the streets faster than the plows could clear it. Emma decided to close early, but before she could turn the sign, Daniel stepped in, shaking the snow from his coat. "You should have gone home already," he said, his voice filled with concern. Emma smiled, handing him a towel. "I was waiting for the storm to calm down." Daniel looked around the dimly lit store. "Then let me keep you company until it does." They both laughed softly. She poured him a cup of coffee, and they sat by the counter while the snowstorm raged outside. The light from the old lamp cast a golden glow on the shelves. The world beyond the window had turned white, silent, almost dreamlike. At one point, a loud creak came from the corner shelf, and a few books tumbled to the floor. "Guess the storm isn't the only thing falling apart," Daniel said with a grin. Together, they tried to fix the shelf. He held the wood steady while she adjusted the brackets. It wasn't a big moment, but the closeness of it, their shoulders brushing, their laughter echoing softly, made Emma's heart beat a little faster. When the shelf was fixed, they stood still for a second, their faces only inches apart. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, everything felt still. Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part surprise, part wonder. She could feel the weight of that moment, like something delicate was balancing between them. Then he took a small step back, giving a quiet, almost shy smile. "You're good at fixing things," he said. Emma's lips curved faintly. "Only the small ones." Daniel nodded. "The small ones are what keep the big things standing." His words lingered in her mind long after he left that night. She watched from the window as he walked down the snowy street, his figure fading into the white. When he disappeared from view, she found herself whispering goodnight to no one but the empty room. From that night onward, their conversations grew a little deeper. Daniel told her about his love for writing, how he once dreamed of publishing a novel but never found the courage to finish it. Emma, in return, spoke about her father and how she missed the way he used to read aloud every night when she was a child. Daniel listened with quiet attention, never interrupting. He had a gift for listening, and Emma found herself saying things she hadn't said out loud in years. Sometimes he'd bring her small things, a packet of her favorite tea, a bookmark he made from an old postcard, or a newspaper article he thought she'd enjoy. They weren't romantic gifts, not really, but they meant something. They were gestures that said, "I notice you." One afternoon, a little girl wandered into the shop while her mother waited outside. She ran her hands along the books and asked Emma, "Do you have any stories with happy endings?" Emma smiled and helped her pick one. When the child left, Daniel turned to her and said quietly, "Do you believe in happy endings?" Emma hesitated. "I believe in trying again. Sometimes that's better than an ending." He looked at her, as if that simple answer had touched something deep inside him. As winter deepened, their routine continued: quiet Thursdays, shared smiles, small talks that felt bigger than they sounded. One evening, Emma found him sitting near the poetry section, lost in thought. "You okay?" she asked gently. Daniel looked up, holding a book of poems in his hands. "This one reminds me of someone I used to know," he said. "She loved words, but never believed they could fix anything." Emma sat beside him. "Maybe she just needed the right words." He smiled faintly. "Maybe." The air between them grew heavy again. Not uncomfortable, but filled with something neither dared to name. He reached out as if to say something, then stopped. "Emma," he began softly, "have you ever felt like life gives you small gifts when you least deserve them?" She looked at him, unsure how to answer. Maybe it's not about deserving them. Maybe it's about noticing them. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the world outside the window disappeared. There was no sound except for the quiet hum of the heater and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, something fragile and real. Before leaving that night, Daniel stood by the door and said, "You know, this place feels like it was waiting for me." Emma smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or maybe you were waiting for it." After he left, she walked around the store slowly, touching the shelves, the books, the chair where he had been sitting. The air still carried the warmth of his presence, for the first time in a long while. She felt that her quiet little bookstore wasn't just a space to escape the world. It was becoming a place where something new might begin. The next morning, she found a folded note on the counter. Daniel must have left it before leaving. It wasn't long, just a few words. "Thank you for the stories, Emma. They're starting to feel like mine, too." She pressed the note to her chest, smiling without realizing it. In the days that followed, she caught herself looking at the door every time the bell rang, wondering if it would be him. Her heart would flutter each time she heard footsteps outside. She didn't know what was happening between them, but whatever it was, it made her feel alive again. And though she couldn't explain why, Emma began to believe that sometimes the most unexpected people walk into your life not to change everything, but to remind you that you're still capable of feeling something beautiful, even after all the quiet years. The morning started like any other in Maplewood. The snow had melted a little, and a soft sunlight filtered through the bookstore windows. Emma was rearranging a shelf when she found a book lying on the counter, the one Daniel had borrowed the week before. The Winter Garden. He had returned it quietly, she assumed, because there was no note, no message, only the book. But when she picked it up, she noticed something unusual. Inside, tucked between the pages, was an envelope with her name written in clean, careful handwriting. Her heart skipped. Daniel's writing was easy to recognize the steady strokes, the small curve at the end of every letter. For a long moment, she just stared at it, afraid to open it. She had no idea what it might say, but her hands trembled slightly as she slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message was simple, but every line carried emotion. Emma, I don't know how to explain what's been happening to me lately. I came to this town to find peace, not people. But then I found your bookstore. And somehow I didn't expect to feel this. Warmth again. You make the world feel gentle. If this is too much, forget this letter ever existed. But if you feel even a small part of what I do, maybe we could share a cup of coffee, not as a customer and shopkeeper, but as two people who might be ready for something real. Emma read the letter twice. Then again. Her chest tightened in a way that was both painful and beautiful. It was the kind of honesty that didn't try to impress, just told the truth. She placed the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. She had been feeling something too, but she never dared to admit it. Daniel's presence had quietly filled her days. His words had softened her nights. The thought of him sitting somewhere, writing this letter, made her heart ache with a strange mix of joy and fear. She wanted to see him, to tell him that she felt the same warmth, the same quiet connection. But she also felt afraid that if she opened her heart again, she might lose the peace she had finally found. The day passed slowly. Every time the doorbell rang, Emma's heart leaped. But Daniel didn't come. Not that day or the next. She waited all week, trying to stay calm, convincing herself that maybe he was busy, or maybe he was waiting for her to respond. On the 5th day, she wrote a small note herself, simple message on cream paper. Daniel, I read your letter. Maybe that coffee sounds nice after all. She slipped it inside one of his favorite books, The Lighthouse Keeper's Journal, and placed it in the exact spot where he usually browsed. Then she waited, but the next Thursday came and went. No Daniel. By the 2nd week, she started worrying. His phone number wasn't written anywhere. He'd never given it, and she'd never asked. It suddenly hit her how little she actually knew about him. He had come into her life like a gentle wave and then disappeared without warning, leaving behind only his letter and an ache in her heart. Days turned into weeks. Snow melted from the rooftops, and early signs of spring appeared in Maplewood. The bookstore felt emptier than it had in years. The lamp by the reading chair flickered sometimes, and the air carried a stillness that no amount of music or tea could fill. Emma tried to distract herself, painting the store walls, changing the layout, reading late into the night. But no matter what she did, her thoughts drifted back to Daniel. She wondered where he was. Did he regret writing that letter? Had she scared him by not responding right away? Or was something else keeping him away? One evening, she found herself sitting in his favorite corner of the bookstore. The chair still had that faint scent of coffee and paper that always reminded her of him. She reread his letter, her eyes tracing every word as though they could somehow bring him back. The line that stood out most was the last one. If you feel even a small part of what I do, she did. She felt it more than she wanted to admit. As the days passed, the ache in her heart didn't fade. Instead, it settled into something quieter, like a secret she carried inside her. She began to realize that maybe the letter wasn't just a confession, it was a moment that reminded her that even after loss and loneliness, she could still feel deeply. A month went by without a sign of Daniel. Then one afternoon, while dusting the shelves, Emma noticed something odd. On the small table by the window, the one Daniel always sat at, there was a folded receipt with a short note scribbled on the back. It wasn't new. It looked like it had been there for weeks, hidden under a pile of papers. The handwriting was his. It read, I'm going away for a while. Needed time to think. If this bookstore still feels like home when I come back, maybe I'll find the courage to walk in again. Emma pressed her lips together, her chest tightening. So he hadn't left without a reason. He had left because he was uncertain, maybe about himself, maybe about her, maybe about starting again. She folded the note carefully and placed it inside. It's the same book where she'd hidden her letter to him. Then she whispered softly, "You'll find your way back." Over the following weeks, Emma tried to live as she always had. But everything she did carried a trace of him. When she arranged books, she thought about the titles he loved. When she made coffee, she caught herself pouring an extra cup. When she looked out at the snow, she imagined him walking through it again. Sometimes she wondered if life gave people moments like this not to break them, but to remind them how deeply they could care. Her friends noticed the change in her how. She smiled less, but looked softer somehow. More thoughtful. When they asked if something was wrong, she just said, "Nothing at all." Because how could she explain that something was missing? But she didn't know if it would ever return. Late one evening, after closing the store, she lit a candle near the window. The town outside was quiet. She thought about Daniel, again the warmth of his voice, the way his eyes softened when he smiled. She whispered into the stillness, "Wherever you are, I hope you're all right." Then she placed his letter back into its envelope and tucked it inside the drawer near her counter. She didn't know if he would ever return, but she also didn't regret the feeling he had given her, unexpected warmth that reminded her that love, even in its simplest form, was still possible. Emma had once thought she was done feeling that way, but Daniel's letter had changed something. It was proof that even in a small town, even in a quiet bookstore, something beautiful could begin, something that might not end with a kiss or a promise, but with a simple truth that two souls could meet, even briefly, and both be better for it. And so, every Thursday, she still flipped the sign to open and made 2 cups of coffee, one for her, and one for someone who might someday walk through the door again. Christmas Eve came to Maplewood, wrapped in quiet snow and golden lights. The streets were calm, lined with wreaths and candles in windows. Inside the little bookstore, Emma moved slowly, humming to herself as she arranged a few last-minute gifts for customers. It had been months since Daniel disappeared, but his absence had settled into her life like a shadow she had learned to live beside. She no longer waited by the door, but a part of her heart still did. The world outside looked like a painting white roofs, frozen trees, and the glow of distant laughter from families gathering for the night. Emma, as always, would spend it alone. It didn't make her sad anymore. Not exactly. She had learned to find comfort in small things: the smell of cinnamon tea, the feel of an old book, the warmth of candlelight. Still, there was an emptiness she couldn't quite fill. A space where Daniel's laughter used to echo in her memory. She was about to close early when the bell above the door rang. Her hand froze mid-motion. The sound was soft, but her heart reacted instantly, beating fast as if it recognized something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. When she turned, she saw him. Daniel stood at the doorway, snow clinging to his coat, his eyes searching for her like someone who'd been away too long. He looked the same, maybe a little tired, but his smile, gentle and sincere, was unmistakable. For a second, Emma couldn't move. It was as if the months apart had vanished, and everything she wanted to say had tangled inside her chest. "Hi," Daniel said, his voice warm but uncertain. "I hope I'm not too late." Emma took a slow step forward. "Late for what?" He smiled faintly. "For another story. Maybe for a beginning." Her heart trembled at his words. "You could have just written another letter," she said softly, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. He shook his head. "I thought about it, but I wanted to see you to say things face to face this time." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box tied with a red ribbon. "I brought you something," he said. Emma hesitated before taking it. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said gently, "but I wanted to. It's not much, just something that reminded me of you." For a moment they both stood there, the silence filled with everything they hadn't said for months. Emma slowly unwrapped the box, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a small wooden bookmark, hand-carved into the shape of an open heart. It was smooth and simple, but beautiful in a quiet way. On the back, engraved in delicate letters, were the words, "For the story that became my favorite." Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening. You made this. He nodded. I found an old workshop near the cabin I stayed in. I wasn't sure if you'd ever want to see me again, but carving this made me feel close to you. It reminded me of the nights we talked about stories, how words can heal, how love can begin in the smallest places. Emma smiled softly, her throat tight with emotion. You didn't need to find big words, Daniel. You just had to come back. He took a step closer. I was afraid you'd moved on. I didn't want to walk in and ruin your peace. Her voice shook. You didn't ruin it. You were part of it. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air between them filled with memories. The warmth of the room seemed to melt the cold that clung to Daniel's coat. Outside, snowflakes danced in the golden light from the window, drifting like whispers from another time. Daniel's voice broke the silence. When I left, I thought I needed time to forget. But all I did was remember your smile, this bookstore, the way you listened when I didn't know what to say. I thought love was something that came with fireworks and promises, but you showed me it can be quiet, steady, and real. Emma felt tears form in her eyes. I thought you wouldn't come back. I almost stopped hoping. He smiled gently. Then I guess this is your unexpected gift. Her lips curved into a trembling smile. And what's the feeling you were talking about in your letter? The one you said you couldn't describe. Daniel looked at her softly, stepping close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath in the cold air. It's this, he said quietly. Standing here with you, knowing I almost lost the best thing that ever happened to me. Emma blinked back tears, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't let herself feel for so long. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything she'd felt during those months apart, but she couldn't find the right words. So instead she smiled through her tears and whispered, You're here now. That's enough. They stood together in the middle of the bookstore, surrounded by the scent of old pages and the flicker of the Christmas lights. There was no grand gesture, no perfect endings, just to people who had found their way back to each other after getting lost for a while. Daniel reached out, brushing his thumb gently across her hand. You once said small things keep the big things standing, he said. I think we're one of those small things. Emma laughed softly, a sound that filled the room with warmth. Maybe we are. He looked around at the familiar shelves. You know, he said, this place feels exactly like I remember, quiet, honest, full of stories that are waiting to be told. She looked up at him and replied, Some stories take longer to finish. Maybe ours just needed time. He nodded slowly. Then let's not rush the ending. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white. Inside, everything felt still, peaceful, and complete in its own imperfect way. Emma walked to the counter, placed the wooden bookmark there, and turned off the bright lights. Leaving only the soft glow of the Christmas tree in the corner, Daniel slipped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him naturally, as if that space had been waiting for him all along. They stood there watching the snow through the window, neither speaking, both content just to be. After a while, Daniel whispered, I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I want it to start here. Emma smiled against his shoulder. Then it's a good place to begin. The clock chimed softly, marking midnight. Christmas had arrived quietly, without noise or grand celebration. But for Emma and Daniel, it was everything, a moment of peace, of love rediscovered, of hearts finding their way home. As they locked the door and stepped out into the falling snow, Daniel looked at her and said, You know, I never believed in fate, but tonight feels different. Emma glanced up at him, her smile glowing beneath the falling snowflakes. Maybe it's not fate, she said softly. Maybe it's just the right time. They walked down the empty street together, their footprints side by side, fading slowly under the falling snow. The world was quiet, the night gentle, and the feeling between them new. Yet familiar, was unlike anything either had felt before. And for both of them, it truly was an unexpected gift, something real, something lasting, and something they would never forget.